Hey folks, before we start, I just wanted to give a real quick disclaimer on the two cameras that I will be talking about in this video. The Panasonic GH5 is a camera that I own personally. I bought that camera back in March, and this video will document my use with that. The Panasonic GH5S was loaned to me by Panasonic a couple months ago to give my honest opinion on, and that is what this video is on as well. So just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you guys for watching. Enjoy the video. Hello everyone, and welcome to another one of these camera videos here on Tested.com. I'm Joey Fameli, one of the video producers here, and today I wanted to talk about a couple cameras that I've been using like crazy, the Panasonic GH5 and the Panasonic GH5S. Some of you guys may remember that last year I was testing out different kinds of cameras, different bodies, different kits. I was essentially looking for a camera to buy, something kind of DSLR size, but still had great quality, great usability, something I can travel with and use a bunch. And I eventually landed on the Panasonic GH5. Now that's what I'm shooting this video with here, is a GH5. I have here the GH5S. I've owned the GH5 about a year. Panasonic sent me this camera, the GH5S, last month to test out. So this video is long overdue. I have a lot to say about these cameras, but first I kind of wanted to just differentiate between these two to avoid any confusion. The GH5 is Panasonic's Micro Four Thirds 4K video beast of a DSLR. It's got this crazy in-body image stabilization, IBIS, which essentially means that the sensor inside the camera is kind of moving and wobbling around to help keep the image more stable. The native ISO on this camera is about 400 on a Micro Four Thirds sensor, which means that sensor is going to be a lot smaller than like your full-frame DSLR, or even the Super 35 size sensor for the Sony FS5, which we use back at Tested as our kind of main A cam. What that means is basically it is a little bit tougher to get really good low light performance with this camera, being that the sensor is smaller and that 400 is your native. You just won't get as good results within a high ISO and low light environment. So let me bring in now the cousin to the GH5, the GH5S. Let me first start by saying that this is not an upgraded version of the GH5. This is not the GH6. This is just a different version of the GH5 with some pretty big differences that I will highlight over. But aside from that, physically, these camera bodies look almost identical, and the button placements are all in the exact same spot. If you use the GH5, you will know how to use the GH5S, no problem. But let's go over some of those differences. First, major one being, there is no in-body image stabilization on this camera. They sacrificed that feature to change the sensor up. The sensor on this camera is different. It's different shaped, it operates differently, it's got different circuitry, it is locked into the body, and because of that, they can open up some more low light functionality, including what is called the dual native ISO. So whereas the GH5 has a 400 native ISO, the GH5S has a native ISO of 400 and also a native ISO of 2500. That allows it for much higher sensitivity and insanely better low light shooting, getting kind of closer up to the Sony A7S II. So let's kick this off with why I chose the GH5 and what kind of projects I've been using it on. But first off, I've been using larger cameras for most of my career. I kind of missed the DSLR wave. This is my first DSLR camera. The shoulder cams that I've been using always had a little bit of support, shoulder support, rail support to give me a smoother image. And one of the things I didn't like about DSLRs, especially early on, was that kind of micro jitter, micro tremor look that you get from like holding onto your sensor and just kind of trying to shoot handheld. A lot of early footage was real shaky, especially on larger screens. You just saw these tiny little movements, and that kind of drove me nuts. And there are lenses that have come out, optical image stabilized lenses that offer a little bit of help there. But I think for that reason alone, I just kind of immediately and probably unfairly dismissed a lot of DSLRs as being video shooters. So when the GH5 got announced with its image stabilized sensor, that kind of obviously drew me towards that camera. So the stabilized sensor on the GH5 pretty much allows me to use any lenses that I want. I don't need to force myself to use image stabilized lenses. I can use my primes, I can use whatever, and know that I have a little bit of assistance there with that 5-axis stabilized sensor. And for about 90% of my traveling documentary work, I use the Panasonic Lumix lenses. This is the 12-35, then I also have the 35-100, which gives me a huge range while I'm traveling. Now, these lenses have an optical image stabilized feature to them. And when it works with the GH5, you actually activate what's called dual image stabilization. That's essentially the lens kind of talking to the camera. As you connect these, the lens is saying, hey, I'm going to be moving elements inside of me to keep things stabilized. The camera is saying, I'm going to do the same. Let's work together and kind of move together and keep everything really stabilized. And that feature is probably one of my favorites. traveling through Cuba, through Brazil, shooting tons of documentary footage, run and gun all through the streets with really long lenses at times, I can get super smooth images, stuff that I would not be able to get without these two kind of working together or without support from like a shoulder rig. This is just me hand holding this camera, shooting across an entire city. Even at ranges like 200 mil, or sometimes I'll use the Panasonic 14 to 140, which on a 2x crop gets to about, 280. So 280 all the way across the park or across town, I can get a nice smooth image using this camera. If you want to see some more footage from this travel work that I've done, go check out the YouTube channel Cloth Map. You'll see a series here on Brazil, and there'll also be an upcoming series on Cuba, and that was pretty much exclusively shot with the GH5 and the GH5S using these Panasonic Lumix lenses. That whole package that I brought, which isn't much bigger than this, maybe with the XLR shoe here to get some audio, that's kind of the perfect travel documentary package for me. Bring 6 batteries in my pocket, bring that kit, and I'm ready to go. I've also used this setup for the Adam Incognito Walk. Now, for those who don't know what that is, it's essentially Adam dressing up in costumes for WonderCon, Comic-Con, and walking the floor, tweeting out hints about who he is, and people come and try to find him. That's a lot harder for people to do if there's not a huge camera crew following him, so we try to be as discreet as possible when we film that. For last year's Comic-Con with John Hodgman, I took the Panasonic GH5, I added the XLR hot shoe, put a lav mic on Adam and set that to the top, put a lav mic on John, set that to the bottom so it wouldn't be as tall, and I was able to follow them around the convention floor all day long without anybody seeing me or even recognize that there was a camera crew following them. It essentially looked like I was just a guy taking photos. Now, when we got to the end of that walk, we got out of the elevator and they spontaneously just started talking and walking. And for me, just to be able to walk backwards relatively quickly down a hallway, I wasn't really set up for this, we didn't plan for this, but I was able to just walk backwards with the camera, kind of feel out where the room was behind me, and this camera was able to keep something of a steady walk to it. There's a little bit of a sway, obviously, and a little bit of movement because I'm kind of tripping over myself, but as far as just walking with the camera backwards relatively quickly, I think this image looks pretty good, and that's one of the benefits of having that dual stabilized functionality with this camera. My next series of tests were essentially me wanting to see what the images looked like as I started stripping away features. So this next series of interviews that I did, I shot on the Panasonic GH5 using the sensor stabilized feature, but then taking off those Panasonic lenses and putting on these Rokinon prime lenses. This one here is a 35mm Rokinon Canon prime that has been metaboned into the camera. The only help that it's getting is from that stabilized sensor. And you can see it's pretty serviceable. I mean, it's a little bit shakier, a little bit more wobbly, but as far as stabilization goes, the sensor working on its own with this 35mm length is pretty good. This is footage that I would totally use and not dismiss as being super shaky at all. So now these next shots are from the GH5S. Again, this is the low light version of the GH5. There is no sensor stabilization in here. The sensor is just locked into the body. I didn't use any Lumix lenses here. I used my Rokinon 50mm prime metaboned in to give me a range that I use quite a bit. This is a very popular range that I use when I'm shooting interviews or shooting documentary work. And so I wanted to see how that would look without any help. So there's no help here whatsoever. No help from the lens, no help from the body. This is just kind of raw footage based off of the camera and the prime lens. And you can see this is where it gets a little bit jittier. This is kind of your more classic early, mid-2000s DSLR look. Me just kind of doing my best to keep it stable, which I do okay at times. I've gotten better at hand-holding cameras, but I still shake. I'm very caffeinated and I still move quite a bit, and you can see that represented here without any help. So next, I took off that prime, off the GH5S, and I put on a Lumix lens. So now I'm getting stabilization from the lens here, but not from the body. So this is much more kind of typical. Our Sony FS5 back at the tested office uses a Canon lens with image stabilization support there, but not on the camera. And that is what we, it's also a shoulder cam, so you have a little bit more support when you're rocking that thing handheld. So this is just without the sensor, just the lens. Like I said, much more typical. Then this was a series of interviews that I did with Kiser over in Palm Springs. And again, you can see it's with me kind of just holding the camera on my own, elbows dug into my body. I can hold it pretty still, and with that lens support, it does look quite serviceable. Very similar to what you saw when it was the prime lens on the GH5S, where it got stabilized support from the sensor. One layer of stabilization support, either from the sensor or from the lens. Both operate pretty good on their own, amazingly together on the GH5 dual stabilized support. So as you can tell, I can't emphasize how much that I love the dual OIS that the GH5 with those Lumix lenses gives you. 80% of my work is documentary, run and gun, travel stuff. And so this camera is kind of perfect for that. This is the perfect run and gun filmmaker's camera. It's also small and discreet, so I can capture real moments without drawing too much attention to myself when I'm traveling. It gives me beautiful 4K video, and if I use the variable frame rates, which these cameras both have, the GH5S I think has a little bit more options there, but both cameras have variable frame rate options going up to like 120 and 1080 or like 60 and 4K, and it's all continuous. So where our FS5 has to kind of shoot some slow-mo, stop, and render, these cameras do all continuous slow-mo. Point was, if you're doing slow-mo with the dual stabilized support and you're kind of doing some speed ramps and stuff, I mean, the movements on those cameras, the movements on this camera with that lens looks beautiful handheld. So let's now get into the low light of these cameras, the differences between the sensors and how they handle low light. There's a lot going on here. I'm going to do my best to explain, but there's quite a bit. First and foremost, the sensor sizes are slightly different. The shapes are slightly different. The GH5S, because it's a locked-in sensor, they're able to make it actually bigger than the barrel opening of the camera. What that means is, as the sensor kind of moves out and you change aspect ratios from photo mode to video mode, 16:9, you're actually able to use a little bit more of the sensor on the left and right side of that barrel, if that makes sense. Instead of the square sensor in the circle, you have a more rectangular sensor in the circle, and then you open up a little bit extra sensor space there, which gives you a little bit better sensitivity for that sensor. So the next big change is the circuitry and the electronics in these sensors. Where the GH5 caters to like a native ISO of 400, this dual native ISO actually kind of changes its readout circuits to activate a dual native ISO, one being 400, and then once you get to 2500, the readout circuits change, and now your native ISO is set there. That gives you much larger range in your ISO. The Panasonic GH5 I will use at 3200 ISO max. The GH5S, I can go up to 6400, it's pretty clean. I'll go to 8000, 10,000. Things kind of start to break apart a little bit after that. Both of these cameras can go to a much higher ISO, but as you can see, just noise destroys that image. For documentary work, it's not always that bad of an option. If you need to capture something, you can just blast your ISO up and get grainy footage, but at least you'll have captured the moment. For film and narrative work, I will tend to go, I have a base ISO for both of these that I will not go over because I do not want to give a dirty image like that. Does it mean that I don't have to light scenes anymore with my GH5S? I can just go low light? Not really. The real benefit to having a sensitive sensor like the GH5S has is, well, there's two reasons. One being that I can have more play with my aperture. I no longer have to be opening wide open to see in darker spots. For example, when we shoot Adam's one-day builds, the GH5 itself is not something I normally use because even though there are bright spots in his shop, there are also really dark spots. And for those shoots, I like to have a little bit of gain and a little bit of ISO applied so that I can close my aperture down to 4, 5.6 and stay within there while I'm shooting. The reason I want to have that aperture range is because I don't want a shallow depth of field. I don't want to be chasing focus as he's running around the shop when he's doing layers of things at different distances. I don't want to be going back and forth. I want a deeper depth of field that I can just kind of float in and out of and then have the ISO and the gain compensate for that night. The GH5 doesn't really work well in that situation. You have to go 3200 ISO and then crank that thing up to 2.8 to see everything. The second benefit to having a more sensitive sensor is that you no longer have to deal with an intense amount of light to light your scenes. I'm still lighting scenes, I can be more nuanced. I can light them with a little bit dimmer and softer sources and crank the ISO up and put the aperture kind of where I want it to be. Whereas when you're using cameras that aren't great in low light, you really have to kind of blast an area light, get everything to a base, and then start adding lights from there. Here you can be much more nuanced. You can kind of play and paint your scene exactly how you want it. And that's what having that extra sensitivity does. It's not just about not lighting a scene. So those are the two major differences between these two cameras. I think the GH5 is absolutely a run and gun's dream. For the stuff that I do, the run and gun, documentary, travel stuff, that camera is perfect. The GH5S I would call more of a cinema version of this camera. And I don't say that with any kind of superiority. I just mean that if you're going to be planning out some shots, maybe throwing this thing on a gimbal, I think a gimbal is where this thing would really shine. Putting it on dolly tracks, putting it on a tripod, or just painting your scene with some nuanced color and light, then I think the GH5S would really shine there over the GH5. Both cameras I have used in narrative short films and different documentary style stuff. They both work well in those environments. I think they are kind of both amazing cameras. And both cameras feel like video cameras to me. I don't really know how to explain that except that like the button placement, the dials, the way the camera kind of moves and operates, the menus, it has audio meters, it has LUT load in, so if you're shooting in Vlog, you can load in a color profile and have a display LUT there. You have time code in and out on the GH5S. I mean, these are features that prosumer video cameras would be jealous of, that the GH5 and the GH5S kind of have loaded in already. If you were looking to buy one of these, I don't know if I can help you very much. You really need to kind of make the choice for yourself. I think they're both amazing cameras. I think if you were to buy one, if you're looking for a camera like this and you were to buy one of these two, you won't be disappointed either way. I chose the GH5, the one I'm shooting you with here, because 80% of my work is documentary, 20% is narrative. The GH5 makes sense. If those numbers were reversed, if I did 80% narrative stuff and 20% documentary, then the GH5S, I can make this camera work for me well in that regards. But it's really something just you check the boxes off, whichever one kind of fits your needs. Again, they're both amazing cameras. There are also a bunch of little differences between these two cameras. The crop factor is a little different. There's some color science things happening. If you're on the fence between these two cameras and you're interested in learning more about those differences, I recommend you go check out a YouTube channel called DSLR Video Shooter. Caleb over there is doing tons of side-by-side tests, kind of investigating all those different differences and showing you the results there. So you can learn much more about the differences between these two cameras over there. That being said, you'll be seeing us use a lot more of these untested. I love the GH5. It's kind of tailor fit to me. It's been a buy that I have not regretted at all. The 4K just looks amazing. You have so many different options and bit rates and data rates and formats. The Vlog is great. It's fun to work with. I love taking that thing into DaVinci and mapping out different color profiles. Again, there is so much more to go into on these two cameras. But I need to wrap up. So if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot them in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching this, and I will see you again next time on another one of our camera videos. Bye. Thank you guys for watching, and thank you to Panasonic for loaning me that GH5S to try out. Again, just as a disclaimer, I own the GH5. Panasonic loaned me that GH5S for the purposes of my opinion in this video. So thank you guys, and I'll catch you next time.